Welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself standing on a wide, unremarkable plain in southern Italy at dawn. The land stretches away in gentle rolls, crossed by a lazy river and dotted with storage buildings for grain. This is Cannae, in the ancient region of Apulia. On a summer morning in 216 before the Common Era, this quiet place witnessed something that should have been impossible. Here, on this ordinary stretch of earth, a smaller army, exhausted, far from home, speaking a dozen different languages, folded the largest Roman force ever assembled into complete and utter silence within a single afternoon. How does such a thing happen? How can 87,000 seasoned soldiers, citizens of the greatest military power in the Mediterranean, simply vanish from history? Tonight, we will walk this forgotten battlefield not as a tale of heroes and villains, but as a lesson in systems, choices, and the strange geometry of human conflict. What transforms a routine engagement into catastrophe? What makes an ordinary day become the stuff of nightmares? And why does this quiet plain still whisper warnings across 23 centuries? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You find yourself standing on a wide, unremarkable plain in the heel of Italy, where the morning light spreads slowly across gentle rolls of earth the colour of old parchment. This is Cannae, in the ancient region of Apulia, and the air carries the dusty sweetness of ripening grain and the faint mineral smell of the Orpheus River as it winds its lazy way toward the Adriatic Sea. The landscape stretches away in every direction, broken only by scattered storage buildings and the occasional stand of olive trees, their silver leaves catching the early sun. It is a place that seems almost aggressively ordinary, the sort of countryside you might pass through on a long journey without pausing to look twice. But on a summer morning in 216 years before the Common Era, this quiet stretch of Apulian farmland became the stage for one of the most devastating military catastrophes in human history. Here, where you might expect nothing more dramatic than the slow turning of grain mills or the seasonal haggling of merchants, 87,000 Roman soldiers and their allies simply vanished from the world. Not in the way that armies sometimes retreat or scatter, leaving behind stragglers and stories, but in the way that morning mist disappears when the sun rises, completely, irrevocably, and with a silence that seemed to swallow even the memory of their voices. The mystery that hangs over this place is not the sort that ancient writers love to embroider, with tales of divine intervention or heroic last stands. It is a quieter, more disturbing puzzle, the kind that keeps military theorists awake at night even now, 23 centuries later. How does it happen? How can the largest army Rome had ever assembled, led by both its elected consuls, supported by the disciplined machinery of the legion system that had conquered most of Italy, simply cease to exist within the span of a single afternoon? The army that met its end here was not some hastily assembled militia or collection of reluctant conscripts. These were seasoned veterans, citizens who had served in the earlier campaigns against Carthage, men who understood the rhythms of formation fighting and the cold mathematics of Roman military discipline. They were supported by allied contingents from across the Italian peninsula, troops who had fought alongside Roman legions in dozens of successful campaigns. Their equipment was first-rate, their supply lines secure, their numbers so overwhelming that many in Rome believed this force alone could end the war by sheer weight of presence. Against them stood an army that, by every reasonable measure, should have been on the verge of collapse. Hannibal's forces had been campaigning in Italy for more than 2 years, far from their supply bases in Spain and North Africa. They were a polyglot collection of Carthaginians, Iberians, Gauls and Numidians, men who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and fought according to different tactical traditions. They had marched over the Alps in one of the most grueling military adventures in ancient history, losing perhaps a third of their strength to cold, hunger, and the knives of mountain tribes. They had won battles, yes, but each victory had cost them irreplaceable men, and there were no reinforcements coming from across the sea. Yet somehow, in the space of perhaps 6 hours, this exhausted, diverse, outnumbered force managed to surround and destroy an army nearly twice its size. Not defeat it, not drive it from the field, but but eliminate it so thoroughly that Roman writers would struggle for generations to find words adequate to the scale of the disaster. When the sun set on Cannae, the Roman system of annual military command lay in ruins. The Senate had lost a generation of its most experienced members, and the very survival of the Roman Republic hung in doubt. The temptation, of course, is to reach for the language of miracle or genius, to frame this as a story of individual brilliance triumphing against impossible odds. Ancient historians certainly felt that temptation, and many modern accounts still present Cannae as the masterpiece of a military artist, a battle won by inspiration and tactical innovation. But there is something more interesting and more unsettling at work here, something that reveals itself only when you move past the romance of great captains and examine the deeper structures that made this catastrophe possible. What happened at Cannae was not magic. It was engineering, the careful application of principles that any competent military commander could understand, executed with the kind of precision that comes from long experience and ruthless attention to detail. It was about formations and timing, about the management of cavalry and the psychology of crowded spaces, about reading terrain and understanding how fear travels through ranks of men pressed too closely together. It was about systems, how armies move, how they communicate, how they maintain cohesion under pressure, and how they fall apart when those systems fail. The story of Cannae is ultimately a lesson in the fragility of complex organizations, whether military or civil, ancient or modern. It demonstrates how advantages can become vulnerabilities, how success can blind leaders to emerging threats, and how the very qualities that make a system strong, size, standardization, confidence in proven methods, can become the instruments of its destruction when circumstances change. The Roman army that died on this plain was not weak or incompetent. It was simply unprepared for an enemy who understood its strengths well enough to turn them into weaknesses. As the morning mist begins to lift from the Aufidus, and the sun climbs higher over this ancient battlefield, you can almost feel the weight of that knowledge settling into the earth, like water into dry soil, becoming part of the landscape's memory. This is where we must begin. Not with heroes and villains, but with the quiet recognition that even the mightiest systems are only as strong as their assumptions about how the world works. To understand how two armies came to face each other on that dusty plain at Cannae, we must first step back from the immediate crisis and consider the broader currents that carried them there, currents as persistent and inexorable as the tides that wash the Mediterranean shores. This is not a story of ancient hatreds or inevitable clashes between East and West, though later historians would often frame it that way. It is instead a tale of two republics, each built on different foundations, each successful in its own sphere, and each gradually discovering that the sea they shared was not large enough for both their ambitions. Rome, in the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, was still, in many ways, a regional power with global aspirations. The city had spent the better part of 3 centuries methodically conquering the Italian peninsula, not through the grand gestures of empire building that we associate with later ages, but through a patient, almost bureaucratic process of alliance, integration, and selective violence. The Romans had perfected a particular kind of statecraft, one that offered their defeated enemies not just subjugation but participation, transforming former adversaries into allies with real stakes in Roman success. This was not mercy, but calculation, a recognition that voluntary cooperation was more durable and less expensive than perpetual occupation. The system worked beautifully within the confines of Italy, where distances were manageable and cultural differences, while real were not insurmountable. Roman roads connected Latin colonies, Roman law provided frameworks for dispute resolution, and Roman military service offered paths to citizenship and social advancement. By the time Rome looked beyond the strait that separated Italy from Sicily, it commanded not just its own legions, but the manpower of dozens of allied communities, each with its own reasons for supporting Roman ventures. Across that narrow stretch of water lay a different kind of republic entirely. Carthage had built its power not on territorial conquest, but on commercial networks that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the Levantine coast. Where Rome thought in terms of allies and citizens, Carthage thought in terms of trading partners and clients. Where Rome built roads and fortresses, Carthage built harbours and warehouses. The Carthaginian state was, in essence, a massive commercial enterprise with its own navy, its own diplomatic corps, and its own methods of organising violence when commerce alone proved insufficient. This difference in approach had served both republics well, as long as their spheres of interest remained separate. Rome could expand through Italy while Carthage managed the sea lanes, each pursuing prosperity in its own way without directly challenging the other's core interests. But Sicily changed everything. The island sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes, close enough to Italy to matter to Roman security, rich enough in grain and other resources to attract Carthaginian investment, and politically fragmented enough to invite intervention from both sides. The First Punic War, which had ended just 23 years before the battle at Cannae, was essentially a collision between these two successful systems. It lasted 24 years, consumed enormous resources, and ended with Rome's unexpected victory at sea, unexpected because Romans had been, until that point, distinctly terrestrial in their military thinking. The peace treaty that followed was harsh, but not deliberately vindictive. Carthage lost Sicily, paid a substantial indemnity, and agreed to limit its naval activities. From Rome's perspective, these were reasonable terms for ending a costly conflict. From Carthage's perspective, they represented a fundamental threat to the commercial networks that made the city wealthy and powerful. The years between the wars were not, as is sometimes suggested, a period of healing or reconciliation. They were an intermission during which both sides prepared for what many understood to be an inevitable second round. Carthage used the time to develop new revenue streams, particularly in Iberia, where silver mines and tribute from local tribes could replace what had been lost in Sicily. Rome used the time to consolidate its gains, integrate Sicily into its alliance system, and learn the lessons of naval warfare that the first conflict had taught. But the deeper tension was systemic rather than territorial. The Mediterranean was becoming too small for two expanding commercial republics, each with its own ideas about how trade should be conducted, disputes resolved, and resources allocated. This was not about conquest in the traditional sense. Neither Rome nor Carthage sought to occupy and administer the other's territory. It was about influence, about the right to determine which ports would be open to which merchants, which communities would be protected and which left vulnerable, which currency would be preferred in which markets. The sea itself became a character in this unfolding drama, its lanes and harbours taking on strategic significance that went far beyond their commercial value. Control of Sicily meant control of the central Mediterranean. Control of the Spanish coast meant access to the silver that funded armies and fleets. Control of key harbours meant the ability to project power across vast distances without maintaining expensive permanent garrisons. Both republics understood these equations, and both began to see neutrality as an increasingly unstable position for the smaller powers caught between them. What makes this conflict particularly interesting from a modern perspective is how thoroughly it was driven by institutional rather than personal factors. Neither Rome nor Carthage was ruled by a single individual whose pride or ambition could be satisfied by negotiation. Both were complex political systems that generated their own momentum through the interaction of citizen assemblies, elected magistrates, influential families, and commercial interests. Peace or war was not a matter of royal whim, but of collective calculation, and both republics calculated that their long-term security required preventing the other from achieving a dominant position in the Western Mediterranean. The stage was thus set for a conflict that would be fought not just on land and sea, but in the minds of every community that bordered the Mediterranean, as each was forced to choose which vision of order and prosperity offered the better prospect for survival. The young man who would one day orchestrate the destruction at Cannae learned his craft not in the lecture halls of military academies or the training grounds of professional soldiers, but in the dusty highlands of Iberia, where the practical education of the empire unfolded one season at a time. Hannibal Barca was 9 years old when he first set foot on Spanish soil, accompanying his father Hamilcar on what would become a 25-year Carthaginian project of rebuilding power through patient accumulation of resources, alliances, and strategic positions. What he witnessed during those formative years was not the romantic adventure that later chroniclers would describe, but the methodical construction of a war, machined through the unglamorous work of administration, negotiation, and the careful management of diverse human motivations. Spain mattered to Carthage in ways that went far beyond simple territorial expansion. The Iberian Peninsula contained something that the commercial republic desperately needed after its defeat in the First Punic War: silver. The mines scattered through the southern and eastern regions produced the metal in quantities that could fund armies, build fleets, and pay the indemnities that Rome had imposed. But silver alone was not enough. The real prize was the creation of a sustainable system that could generate revenue, manpower, and strategic depth simultaneously, a new foundation for Carthaginian power that would not depend on the vulnerable sea lanes that Rome now contested. Hamilcar understood this with the clarity that comes from having lost a war. He had been one of Carthage's most successful commanders during the long struggle over Sicily, and he had watched his city's defeat unfold not through any single catastrophic battle, but through the slow strangulation of its maritime supply lines. The lesson was clear. Carthage needed a territorial base that could sustain itself, provide resources for future conflicts, and serve as a launching point for operations that Rome could not easily disrupt. Spain, with its mineral wealth, its diverse tribal populations, and its strategic position at the far end of the Mediterranean, offered exactly such an opportunity. The process of building this new power base was neither swift nor simple. It required the delicate work of transforming military occupation into something approaching voluntary cooperation, and this transformation had to be accomplished one community at a time. Hamilcar and his successors, first his son-in-law Hasdrubal, then Hannibal himself, spent decades learning the intricate politics of Iberian tribal society, understanding which communities could be trusted with autonomy, which required direct oversight, which could be played against each other, and which had to be crushed completely to prevent them from inspiring resistance elsewhere. The system they developed was a masterpiece of practical imperialism. Local chieftains who submitted were confirmed in their traditional authority, but bound by treaties that specified tribute payments, military service requirements, and limitations on their freedom to make war or alliance with other communities. Those who proved reliable were rewarded with favourable trade arrangements, protection against their enemies, and access to the broader Mediterranean commercial network that Carthage controlled. Those who proved troublesome found their territories occupied by Carthaginian garrisons and their populations relocated or enslaved. Hannibal absorbed these lessons during his youth, learning to see warfare not as a series of heroic confrontations, but as one tool among many for achieving political objectives. He watched his father and Hasdrubal negotiate with Spanish tribal leaders, managing complex webs of alliance and obligation that had to be constantly adjusted as circumstances changed. He observed the patient work of intelligence gathering, understanding which communities were wavering in their loyalty, which leaders could be bribed or threatened into compliance, which trade routes were most vulnerable to disruption. He learned to think in terms of supply lines and seasonal campaigns, of the delicate balance between extracting enough resources to fund military operations and leaving enough wealth in local hands to prevent rebellion. By the time Hannibal inherited command of Carthaginian forces in Spain at the age of 26, he presided over a sophisticated system that was part commercial enterprise, part military occupation, and part diplomatic network. The silver mines of Cartagena alone provided revenues that rivaled the tribute from entire provinces in the Roman sphere. Spanish infantry, trained in Carthaginian methods but fighting with weapons and tactics adapted to their own traditions, formed the backbone of his army. Iberian cavalry, renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their skill and mobility, provided the fast-moving strike force that Roman commanders would learn to fear. But perhaps most importantly, Hannibal had inherited something that money and military skill alone could not create: credibility. His family's 25-year investment in Spanish relationships had created a network of personal loyalties and institutional arrangements that gave him access to resources on a scale that purely mercenary relationships could never have sustained. When he called for troops, they came not just because of immediate payment, but because of long-standing obligations and expectations of future reward. When he needed intelligence about Roman movements or political developments, he could rely on information networks that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Pyrenees. This foundation made possible what would have been unthinkable for any other Carthaginian commander: a sustained military campaign on foreign soil, far from Carthaginian supply bases, dependent entirely on the resources that could be carried or captured along the way. The decision to march into Italy was not the impulsive gesture of a young general drunk on his own success, but the calculated application of a power structure that had been 2 decades in the building. The Spanish silver funded the expedition, Spanish soldiers formed its core, and Spanish political relationships provided the secure base to which it could theoretically return if circumstances required retreat. The machinery was now in place, its gears turning with the inexorable rhythm of seasonal campaigns and annual tribute payments. What had begun as Carthage's attempt to recover from defeat had evolved into something far more dangerous, a complete alternative to Roman hegemony in the Western Mediterranean, built on different principles and backed by different resources, but equally capable of projecting power across vast distances. The crossing of the Alps was nothing like the heroic adventure that imagination conjures, with its images of war elephants silhouetted against snowy peaks and brave soldiers conquering the unconquerable. The reality was far grimmer and more instructive. A slow-motion catastrophe of logistics stretched beyond their limits, of men and animals dying not in glorious battle, but from exposure, hunger, and the simple inability of organic systems to function in an environment they were never designed to endure. When Hannibal's army finally descended into the Po Valley in late 218 before the Common Era, it had been transformed from a confident expeditionary force into something closer to a collection of survivors, held together by discipline, shared suffering, and the promise that their ordeal had purpose. The losses were staggering in their quiet accumulation. Of the roughly 90,000 men and 12,000 cavalry who had crossed the Ebro River in Spain, perhaps 26,000 infantry and 6,000 horsemen reached Italian soil. The elephants, so fearsome in Mediterranean warfare, had been reduced from 37 to a single surviving animal. These were not casualties of combat, but of attrition, the relentless arithmetic of insufficient food, inadequate shelter, and the thousand small failures that occur when any complex system operates beyond its design parameters for too long. Yet what remained was, in many ways, more dangerous than what had been lost. The survivors were veterans who had endured something that should have broken them, and their survival had taught them lessons about endurance, improvisation, and mutual dependence that no amount of peacetime training could provide. They had also been refined by their ordeal, stripped of everything non-essential, and reduced to the core elements that make armies effective: discipline, loyalty to their immediate commanders, and the kind of desperate competence that emerges when failure means death. The Romans, who received news of Hannibal's arrival in Italy, found themselves facing a strategic problem for which their institutional systems were poorly adapted. Roman military command operated on an annual cycle, with 2 consuls elected each year to serve both as chief magistrates and supreme military commanders. This system worked well enough for the methodical business of expanding Roman influence through Italy, where campaigns typically lasted a single season, and enemies could be defeated through the patient application of superior resources and organisation. But it was less well suited to the kind of extended, adaptive warfare that Hannibal brought to Italian soil. The first Roman commanders to face Hannibal learned these limitations through bitter experience. At the Trebia River, in the winter cold of 218, Consul Tiberius, Sempronius Longus led his forces into battle against an enemy who had spent months learning to fight in Italian conditions, while the Romans were still adjusting to the idea that their homeland could become a battlefield. The result was a defeat that combined tactical sophistication on one side with overconfidence on the other, leaving thousands of Roman and Allied soldiers dead in the snow and mud of the Po Valley. The following spring brought an even more devastating lesson at Lake Trasimene, where Consul Gaius Flaminius marched his army directly into an ambush that had been prepared with the patient attention to detail that characterized all of Hannibal's operations. The ambush itself was a masterpiece of terrain analysis and psychological manipulation, but its larger significance lay in what it revealed about the interaction between Roman political pressures and military decision-making. Flaminius had been under enormous pressure to bring Hannibal to battle, both from the Roman Senate and from public opinion that demanded swift action against an invader who seemed to move through Italy with impunity. This pressure was not merely political, but structural, built into the very foundations of Roman governance. Consuls served for only 1 year, which meant that they had limited time to achieve the kind of decisive results that would secure their reputations and justify their election. A consul who spent his year in office avoiding battle might be strategically sound, but would likely find himself politically ruined, remembered as the man who allowed Rome's enemies to ravage Italian territory while he did nothing. This created a systematic bias toward aggressive action, even when circumstances argued for patience and careful preparation. The disaster at Trasimene killed not just 15,000 Roman soldiers, but also the consul himself, and it forced Rome's leadership to confront a troubling possibility that their traditional methods of warfare might be inadequate against this particular enemy. The response was unprecedented in Roman history. For the first time in decades, the Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, with extraordinary powers and a mandate to prosecute the war as he saw fit, freed from the normal constraints of annual elections and shared command. Fabius understood something that his predecessors had not, that time itself could be a weapon. Hannibal's army, for all its tactical brilliance, remained fundamentally dependent on what it could capture or extract from the Italian countryside. It had no secure supply lines back to Spain or Carthage, no permanent bases where it could rest and refit, no reliable sources of reinforcement to replace the inevitable casualties of campaigning. Every day that it remained in Italy was a day that brought it closer to dissolution through the simple mathematics of attrition. The strategy that emerged from this understanding was psychologically difficult but strategically sound. Avoid pitched battles, shadow the enemy, attack supply trains and foraging parties, but never offer the kind of decisive engagement that might end the war with a single stroke. It was a strategy that required Romans to watch their own territories being ravaged while doing nothing that looked like decisive action, and it earned Fabius the mocking nickname Cunctator, the delayer, from critics who saw patience as cowardice. But time, as Fabius understood, was the one resource that favoured Rome over its enemy. The road to Cannae runs southeast from Rome through landscapes that seem designed to teach lessons about the relationship between geography and power. As you follow its dusty course through the Apennine foothills and down into the broad plains of Apulia, you begin to understand why armies have always been drawn to this particular stretch of Italian countryside, not for its beauty or strategic position in any dramatic sense, but for something far more prosaic and far more essential: food. The town of Cannae sits at the intersection of several ancient trade routes, but more importantly, it sits at the heart of one of Italy's great granaries, surrounded by fields that stretch to the horizon in gentle undulations of wheat, barley, and other grains that feed cities and armies alike. In the summer of 216 before the Common Era, as the sun climbed higher each day and the grain approached harvest, both Roman and Carthaginian commanders found their attention drawn inexorably to this unremarkable market town. Their armies had been manoeuvring around each other for months, each trying to gain some advantage that might force a decisive confrontation on favourable terms, but underneath all the tactical calculations and strategic posturing lay a simpler, more urgent question: how to feed tens of thousands of men and animals in a landscape where local communities could provide only a fraction of what such massive concentrations of humanity required. The granaries at Cannae were not particularly impressive structures, simple stone buildings designed for function rather than grandeur, with thick walls to keep out moisture and vermin, and carefully designed ventilation systems to prevent the accumulation of heat and humidity that could spoil stored grain. But their contents represented something that no amount of tactical brilliance could replace: the calories that kept armies moving. Each soldier required roughly 2 pounds of grain per day, along with oil, wine, salt, and whatever meat or vegetables could be obtained through foraging or local purchase. A cavalry horse needed 20 pounds of fodder daily, and the oxen that pulled supply wagons required even more. The mathematics were inexorable. An army of 80,000 men and 10,000 animals needed roughly 400 tons of food every single day just to maintain basic fighting effectiveness. These calculations shaped military campaigns in ways that romantic accounts of ancient warfare rarely acknowledge. Armies moved not just in response to enemy actions, but according to the rhythms of harvest and storage, supply and consumption. They gravitated toward river valleys where grain could be transported by barge, toward crossroads where multiple supply lines converged, toward regions where local agriculture could supplement what they carried in their own wagons. The great battles of antiquity often took place not where commanders chose to fight, but where the logic of feeding large numbers of men and animals made fighting inevitable. Cannae represented exactly such a convergence of logistical necessity. The town controlled access to the stored grain of several seasons, accumulated from farms scattered across the fertile plains that stretched from the Orphetus River to the distant coastline. Roads from 4 directions met at its modest forum, and barges carrying grain down the river could dock at its small harbour to transfer their cargoes to wheeled transport heading inland toward Rome or south toward the Greek cities of Magna Graecia. For an army operating far from its own supply bases, as Hannibal's forces had been doing for nearly 2 years, such a concentration of resources represented an irresistible opportunity. For the Romans, the strategic significance of Cannae was equally compelling, but for different reasons. Control of the town and its granaries was not just about feeding their own forces, but about denying those resources to their enemy. An invading army that could not secure reliable access to local food supplies was condemned to a slow death by attrition, forced to disperse into smaller foraging parties that could be picked off by local militia, or to retreat toward regions where supplies might be more readily available. Holding Cannae meant maintaining Roman control over the economic lifelines that connected the agricultural heartland of Apulia with the broader network of cities and markets that sustained Roman power. The landscape around the town also held tactical significance that went beyond its value as a storehouse. The plains of Apulia were among the few places in Italy where large armies could deploy in the formal battle lines that both Roman and Carthaginian military doctrine preferred. The terrain was relatively flat and open, without the forests, marshes, or broken ground that could disrupt formations or provide concealment for ambushes. This openness favoured the side with superior cavalry, since mounted troops could operate with maximum effectiveness only when they had room to manoeuvre, charge, and reform, without being channeled or constrained by natural obstacles. Hannibal, whose army included some of the finest cavalry in the Mediterranean world, understood these geographical advantages perfectly. The flat ground around Cannae offered his Numidian horsemen and Spanish cavalry space to demonstrate the mobility and tactical flexibility that made them so dangerous to infantry-heavy Roman formations. For the Romans, whose military system had evolved through centuries of fighting in the hill country of central Italy, the open plains represented both an opportunity and a risk. An opportunity to bring their superior numbers to bear in the kind of direct frontal engagement that Roman tactical doctrine was designed for, but also a risk that their traditional advantages in discipline and heavy infantry combat might be neutralized by an enemy with better horses and more imaginative use of combined arms. As summer deepened and the grain ripened in fields that stretched beyond the horizon, both armies moved slowly but inexorably toward this convergence of necessity and opportunity, drawn by the simple but compelling logic of empty stomachs and full granaries. The Roman military system that marched toward Cannae in the summer of 216 was not the professional standing army that would later conquer the known world, but something both more democratic and more fragile. A citizen militia expanded to unprecedented proportions by the desperate mathematics of existential warfare. To understand what happened on that dusty plain in Apulia, you must first understand the institutional machinery that made it possible for a single Mediterranean city to put 87,000 men into the field at one time, and why that very achievement contained the seeds of catastrophe. The foundation of Roman military power rested on a principle that was radical in its time and remains remarkable today. The idea that ordinary citizens temporarily called from their farms and workshops could be trained to fight with a discipline and effectiveness that rivaled any professional warrior class. The legion was not simply a military unit, but a cross-section of Roman society in arms, organised according to age, wealth, and experience in ways that reflected the social hierarchies of civilian life. The youngest and poorest served as velites, light troops who skirmished ahead of the main battle line with javelins and small shields. Citizens of moderate means formed the Astati and Princeps, the heavy infantry who carried the distinctive rectangular shields and short swords that had conquered most of Italy. The oldest and wealthiest served as Triarii, veterans who formed the final reserve line, and whose presence gave rise to the saying that matters had come to the Triarii when a situation became truly desperate. This system produced soldiers who fought not as individual warriors seeking personal glory, but as interchangeable components of a larger mechanism, trained to maintain their positions in formation even under extreme pressure, to obey orders instantly and without question, and to trust that their survival depended not on their individual skill, but on the collective discipline of their unit. Roman military training emphasized repetition, standardization, and the kind of automatic responses that allowed large groups of men to function as a single organism even in the chaos and terror of battle. A Roman soldier learned to march in step, to deploy from column into line according to standardized signals, to maintain exact intervals between himself and his comrades, and to wield his weapons with techniques that had been refined through generations of practical experience. But the genius of the Roman system lay not just in its ability to train individual citizens to fight, but in its capacity to integrate the manpower of dozens of Italian communities into a single military structure. By the time of the Second Punic War, Roman armies were roughly half Roman and half Allied, with contingents from Latin colonies, Samnite hill towns, Greek cities in the south, and Etruscan communities in the north. These allies fought not as mercenaries motivated solely by pay, but as participants in a larger political project from which they derived real benefits: protection from their enemies, access to Roman markets, opportunities for their young men to gain military experience and social advancement, and the possibility that exceptional service might eventually lead to Roman citizenship itself. The Allied contingents brought their own weapons, their own tactical traditions, and their own reasons for fighting, but they were integrated into Roman formations, according to principles that had been developed through 2 centuries of experience. Allied infantry fought alongside the legions, not as separate units, but as organic components of the same tactical system. Allied cavalry provided mobility and reconnaissance capabilities that Roman forces, traditionally focused on heavy infantry combat, had always lacked. The result was an army that combined the disciplined reliability of Roman citizen soldiers with the diverse skills and local knowledge of dozens of different Italian peoples. This was the military machine that Rome's leaders decided to employ on an unprecedented scale in response to Hannibal's victories at Trebia and Trasimene. The decision to concentrate 8 legions and their allied equivalents into a single army represented a massive investment of human and material resources. But more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in Roman strategic thinking. Instead of the patient, methodical campaigns that had built Roman power in Italy, the Senate and people of Rome demanded a swift, decisive solution to the Carthaginian threat. The political pressures driving this decision were as powerful as they were understandable. Roman citizens had watched their territories ravaged, their allies defect, and their armies defeated by an enemy who seemed to move through Italy with impunity. The annual electoral cycle that brought new consuls to power each year created enormous pressure for quick results, since commanders who spent their year in office, avoiding battle, were likely to find their political careers terminated along with their military commands. Public opinion, shaped by reports of Carthaginian atrocities and the visible evidence of burned farms and abandoned towns, demanded action that looked decisive rather than prudent. The army that resulted from these pressures was impressive in its sheer scale, but unwieldy in ways that its creators failed to fully appreciate. 87,000 men required a supply train of enormous proportions, moving slowly across the Italian countryside like a city on the march. The complexity of coordinating so many different units, each with its own traditions and command structures, created communication challenges that had never been tested under combat conditions. Most dangerously, the very size of the force bred a psychological confidence that bordered on complacency, a sense that quantity alone could solve problems that previous, smaller armies had failed to address. As this massive force moved slowly southeast toward its confrontation with destiny, it carried with it not just the military resources of Rome and its allies, but the accumulated weight of institutional assumptions, political pressures, and strategic miscalculations that would soon be tested against the patient intelligence of an enemy who understood exactly how to turn Roman strengths into Roman vulnerabilities. The army that faced Rome across the plains of Cannae was unlike anything the Mediterranean world had ever seen. Not because of its size, for Roman forces outnumbered it substantially, but because of its extraordinary diversity. If you could have walked through Hannibal's camp on the evening before the battle, you would have heard conversations in at least half a dozen languages, the Semitic tongues of Carthaginian officers and African infantry, the Celtic dialects of Gallic warriors recruited during the march through what would later be called France, the Iberian languages of Spanish tribal contingents, and the Berber speech of Numidian cavalry, whose horses had been bred in the deserts and hills of North Africa. Each group brought its own weapons, its own fighting techniques, its own concepts of honour and obligation, and its own reasons for being hundreds of miles from home in the service of a Carthaginian general. This diversity was not accidental but carefully orchestrated, the result of a strategic vision that understood how different military capabilities could be combined into something more effective than the sum of its parts. The core of Hannibal's army consisted of African infantry, Libyans, and other North African peoples who had been fighting for Carthage for generations and who formed the disciplined backbone around which the more volatile elements could be organised. These men carried weapons and armour stripped from defeated Roman armies, fought in formations adapted from Roman tactical manuals, and possessed the kind of professional competence that comes only from years of continuous campaigning under competent leadership. Around this reliable centre, Hannibal had arranged contingents that provided capabilities his African troops could not, Spanish infantry renowned for their skill with sword and javelin, whose weapons were forged from the finest steel that Iberian smiths could produce, Gallic warriors whose fierce enthusiasm in battle could break enemy formations that had withstood more methodical attacks, Balearic slingers whose accuracy with their simple but deadly weapons exceeded that of any other missile troops in the ancient world, and above all, cavalry forces whose quality and quantity gave Hannibal an overwhelming advantage in the most mobile and flexible arm of ancient warfare. The Numidian cavalry, in particular, represented a military asset that Rome simply could not match. These horsemen had grown up in the saddle, learning to ride before they could properly walk, developing an intuitive understanding of mounted warfare that no amount of training could replicate. They rode without saddles or bridles in the modern sense, controlling their mounts through subtle shifts of weight and pressure that left their hands free to wield javelins with devastating effectiveness. Their horses, bred for endurance rather than size, could cover enormous distances without exhaustion, and could subsist on forage that would starve larger European breeds. But raw capability was only part of what made these diverse forces effective. The real challenge lay in creating cohesion among men who had little in common beyond their temporary allegiance to Hannibal's cause, and it was here that the Carthaginian general demonstrated a kind of leadership that went far beyond the charismatic heroics that ancient sources often emphasized. Command in such an army was essentially an exercise in translation, not just of languages, though Hannibal reportedly spoke several fluently, but of expectations, motivations, and cultural assumptions that shaped how different groups understood concepts like loyalty, honour, and acceptable risk. The Spanish contingents, for example, fought primarily for loot and the promise of land grants in territories that Carthage might conquer. They were bound to Hannibal not by abstract political allegiance, but by personal oaths that created relationships of mutual obligation between leaders and followers. Managing these troops required understanding the complex hierarchies of Iberian tribal society, knowing which chiefs commanded genuine loyalty and which were merely opportunistic, and maintaining the delicate balance between discipline and autonomy that kept Spanish warriors effective without destroying their distinctive fighting spirit. The Gallic warriors presented different challenges entirely. They fought for glory, for the chance to prove their valour against worthy enemies, and for the simple pleasure of combat itself. They were capable of extraordinary ferocity when their blood was up, but they were also prone to melting away when a campaign grew tedious or when the prospect of immediate reward seemed distant. Hannibal had learned to employ them in roles that matched their temperament, shock attacks where their wild courage could shatter enemy formations, pursuit actions where their enthusiasm could be channeled productively, and siege operations where their physical strength could be put to practical use. The cavalry forces required yet another approach to leadership. The Numidians, despite their military effectiveness, were notoriously independent, and would disappear entirely if they perceived that their interests were not being served. They had to be managed through a combination of generous payment, respect for their customs and leaders, and the kind of tactical employment that allowed them to demonstrate their superiority over enemy horsemen. The Spanish cavalry, heavier and more disciplined than their African counterparts, could be used more like conventional military units, but still required commanders who understood the warrior ethos that motivated them. What held this extraordinary collection together was not ideology or national identity, but something more practical and more fragile: success. Each contingent remained loyal to Hannibal as long as service in his army provided better prospects than the available alternatives, and each had different criteria for measuring those prospects. The key to maintaining cohesion was ensuring that every group received the kind of rewards it most valued, whether that was immediate plunder opportunities for individual distinction, political advancement, or simply the satisfaction of fighting alongside the most successful general of the age. This system worked, but it worked only as long as Hannibal could deliver the victories that justified each group's continued participation in his extraordinary experiment in multinational warfare. Picture yourself standing in that strange hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, when the air carries the coolness of vanished stars but promises the heat that will soon follow. You're on the plain of Cannae in the early hours of August 2nd, in the year 216 before the Common Era, and around you the landscape is stirring with the quiet movements of armies preparing for what they know will be their last peaceful morning for a very long time. The Aufidus River moves slowly past your position, with the soft murmur of summer water running low in its banks, carrying the mineral smell of distant mountains and the faint sweetness of reeds growing along its marshy edges. To your west, spread across the rising ground that slopes gently away from the river, the Roman camp sprawls in the methodical grid pattern that Roman engineering had perfected through generations of campaign experience. Even in the half-light of early dawn, you can sense the enormous scale of the encampment, row upon row of leather tents arranged with mathematical precision, cooking fires sending thin columns of smoke into the still air, the distant sound of men moving with the unhurried efficiency of soldiers following routines that have become second nature. The camp faces southeast, positioned so that the morning sun will rise behind the Roman lines when battle comes, shining into the eyes of any enemy who approaches from that direction. Across the plain, perhaps a mile and a half away, the Carthaginian camp presents a very different aspect. Smaller, more compact, arranged not in rigid geometric patterns, but in clusters that reflect the diverse origins of Hannibal's polyglot army. It seems to crouch against the landscape like a temporary settlement of nomads rather than the permanent fortress that Roman military doctrine would have demanded. But its positioning reveals a subtle understanding of the terrain that goes beyond simple defensive considerations. The camp sits on ground that is slightly elevated but not conspicuously so, close enough to the river to ensure access to water, but far enough away to avoid the morning mists that rise from the marshes downstream. Between these two concentrations of armed humanity, the plain stretches away in gentle undulations of brown earth and yellowing grass, broken by occasional stands of olive trees and the scattered stone walls that mark field boundaries and property lines. It is landscape that seems almost aggressively ordinary, the kind of countryside that travellers pass through without pausing to look twice. Yet every fold in the ground, every slight rise or depression, will soon take on significance that its original creators never intended. The field where local farmers have grown grain for generations will become a chessboard, on which the fate of empires will be decided through the movement of human pieces across squares, measured not in acres, but in the distance a man can march in formation without losing his place in the line. As the eastern sky begins to show the first pale hint of sunrise, you become aware of the wind that has been moving across the plain throughout the night, carrying dust from the harvested fields and the dry, herbal scent of Mediterranean summer. This is the sirocco, the hot southern wind that blows up from Africa during the warmest months, and its steady pressure from the southeast creates conditions that will profoundly influence everything that follows. Dust kicked up by marching feet will be blown directly into Roman faces as they advance, while the Carthaginian forces, positioned with their backs to the wind, will fight in relatively clear air. This advantage was not planned by any human intelligence but simply recognized and exploited by commanders who understood that nature offers gifts to those patient enough to observe them. The river itself presents its own tactical considerations, winding across the southern edge of what will become the battlefield in curves that create pockets of marshy ground and shallow fords where cavalry might cross if circumstances require it. Its banks are lined with reeds and low shrubs that could provide concealment for light troops, while the deeper pools offer watering points for the thousands of horses and pack animals that both armies require. But more importantly, the river creates a natural boundary that will limit the directions in which a defeated army might retreat, channeling any route into predictable paths that a competent commander can anticipate and exploit. As full daylight approaches and the heat begins to build in earnest, you can see the first stirrings of movement in both camps as soldiers emerge from their tents and begin the familiar routines of preparation. checking weapons and armour, consuming the simple breakfast of bread and wine that will have to sustain them through whatever follows, forming into the small units that will march out to take their places in formations that have been planned and rehearsed, but never tested under the particular conditions that this day will bring. There is no urgency in these movements, no sense of panic or desperate haste, but rather the methodical efficiency of men who understand their roles in a complex system and trust that system to function as it has been designed to function. The armies that will soon face each other across this unremarkable stretch of Apulian farmland are not yet enemies in any emotional sense, but simply alternative solutions to the same tactical problem. How to arrange human beings in space and time so that their collective violence can be applied most effectively against an opponent attempting to do exactly the same thing. They are diagrams made flesh, geometric patterns that will soon begin to move according to principles that have been tested in dozens of previous battles, guided by commanders who understand that warfare at this level is fundamentally a matter of engineering rather than inspiration. The battle begins not with the clash of shield against shield or the thunder of charging cavalry, but with something far more tentative and careful, the quiet dance of reconnaissance that must precede any commitment of the main forces. As the morning heat builds across the plain, and both armies complete their deployment into battle lines, the first movements are those of the velites, the youngest Roman soldiers, who trot forward from their positions behind the heavy infantry with the loose, easy gait of men accustomed to operating in small groups rather than tight formations. These are not the disciplined automata of the legion proper, but something closer to hunters, armed with light javelins and small round shields, trained to fight as individuals while maintaining just enough coordination to support each other when circumstances require it. Their counterparts on the Carthaginian side are an even more diverse collection. Balearic slingers whose accuracy with their simple but deadly weapons has been honed since childhood, Numidian javelin throwers mounted on swift horses that can close rapidly with an enemy formation and withdraw before any organised response can be mounted, and Spanish light infantry whose skill with sword and dart has been tested in dozens of tribal conflicts across the Iberian Peninsula. What unites these disparate forces is not uniform training or standardised equipment, but a common understanding of their role in the larger tactical system to probe enemy dispositions, disrupt formations where possible, and above all to gather the information that commanders require before committing their more valuable heavy troops to decisive action. The engagement that develops between these screening forces is less a battle than a series of small, seemingly random encounters scattered across the front of both armies. Individual Roman velites dart forward to hurl their javelins at clusters of enemy skirmishers, then retreat quickly before the inevitable response. Numidian horsemen sweep in from the flanks to threaten isolated groups of Roman light troops, forcing them to cluster together in defensive formations that reduce their effectiveness as mobile reconnaissance assets. Balearic slingers, operating from positions carefully chosen to maximize their range advantage, send volleys of stones arcing high over the battlefield to crash down among Roman formations, with an accuracy that seems almost supernatural to men who have never witnessed such skill. But this apparent chaos serves a larger purpose that becomes clear only when observed from the perspective of the commanding generals, each of whom is using the actions of his light troops to test the responses of his opponent, to identify weaknesses in enemy deployments, and to create the conditions for more decisive action by his main forces. The velites are not simply fighting for the sake of fighting, but are serving as the eyes and ears of the Roman army, pushing forward to determine exactly where Carthaginian units are positioned, how quickly they respond to threats, and whether there are gaps or vulnerabilities that might be exploited by heavier troops. Similarly, the Carthaginian skirmishers are systematically probing the Roman line, testing the discipline of enemy formations, looking for units that might be separated from their supports, and generally preparing the battlefield for the larger movements that will soon follow. As this preliminary phase continues, attention gradually shifts to the wings of both armies, where the decisive contest is already beginning to unfold. Here the stakes are higher and the implications more far-reaching, because cavalry in ancient warfare serves functions that go far beyond simple combat effectiveness. Mounted troops are the primary source of battlefield intelligence, providing commanders with the mobility needed to observe enemy movements and communicate with distant parts of their own forces. They are also the principal means by which an army maintains contact with its supply lines and secures its routes of retreat should circumstances require withdrawal. Most crucially, cavalry provides the capability to exploit success by pursuing defeated enemies and preventing them from reforming, or conversely, to limit the consequences of defeat by covering the withdrawal of friendly forces. On the Roman right wing, the cavalry engagement develops with the methodical precision that characterizes all aspects of Roman military doctrine. The Roman and allied horsemen advance in carefully ordered ranks, maintaining their formation integrity, even as they close with an enemy whose tactical approach is fundamentally different from their own. These are not professional cavalrymen in the sense that their Carthaginian opponents are, but citizen soldiers who have learned to fight on horseback as one aspect of their broader military education. They rely on discipline, coordination, and the mutual support that comes from fighting alongside men they have trained with for years, rather than on the individual skill and intuitive understanding of mounted warfare that characterizes their opponents. Against them, Hannibal deploys the flower of his cavalry force, Spanish horsemen whose weapons and tactics have been refined through generations of warfare among the tribes of the Iberian Peninsula, supported by contingents of Gallic cavalry whose wild courage can shatter formations that have withstood more methodical attacks. These men fight not as components of a larger machine, but as individual warriors who happen to be operating in coordination with others, each relying on personal skill, quick reflexes, and an instinctive understanding of how horses move and fight in combat situations. The engagement that results is not the romantic single combat of heroic literature, but something more prosaic and more deadly, a grinding contest of attrition in which the superior numbers and equipment of one side are matched against the superior skill and mobility of the other. As the morning wears on and the heat continues to build, it becomes clear that this seemingly peripheral action will determine the fate of everything that follows, because control of the cavalry battle means control of the battlefield's edges, and control of the edges means the ability to threaten an enemy's flanks and rear while protecting one's own. As the morning advances and the preliminary skirmishing begins to resolve itself into more decisive patterns of movement, attention turns inevitably to the centre of the battlefield, where the main infantry forces of both armies face each other, across perhaps 400 yards of open ground. Here, in what should be the most straightforward aspect of the entire engagement, heavy infantry against heavy infantry, in the kind of frontal collision that had decided countless battles throughout the Mediterranean world, Hannibal chooses to implement a tactical conception so subtle and so counterintuitive that many modern historians have struggled to believe that it could have been planned rather than improvised in response to unexpected circumstances. The Carthaginian battle line that stretches across the centre of the field appears to Roman observers to follow conventional patterns of deployment. In the front ranks stand contingents of Spanish and Gallic infantry, warriors whose courage and individual skill are legendary, but whose discipline in formation fighting has always been considered somewhat questionable by commanders trained in the methodical traditions of Mediterranean warfare. Behind them, presumably in reserve positions where they can be committed when the initial clash has determined the course of the engagement, are the African heavy infantry who form the professional corps of Hannibal's army, equipped with captured Roman weapons and trained in tactics adapted from Roman military manuals. But this apparently conventional arrangement conceals a design that violates every principle of sound tactical doctrine as understood by military theorists of the age. Instead of placing his most reliable troops in the front line where they can absorb the initial shock of enemy contact and maintain formation integrity under pressure, Hannibal has deliberately positioned his least disciplined forces, Spanish tribal warriors, and Gallic volunteers whose fighting style emphasizes individual valor over collective coordination, in the positions where they will bear the full weight of Roman attack. Behind them, the disciplined African infantry wait not in a traditional reserve role but in a formation that can only be understood as preparation for a maneuver that no rational commander would attempt, a deliberate controlled withdrawal of the centre, while maintaining just enough cohesion to avoid complete collapse. The psychology underlying this extraordinary gamble requires understanding something fundamental about human behaviour in combat situations, particularly the behaviour of men fighting in the tightly packed formations that characterised ancient infantry warfare. When a line of soldiers advances successfully against enemy resistance, pushing their opponents backward and gaining ground with each step, a peculiar form of tunnel vision tends to develop. Individual soldiers become focused on the immediate tactical situation directly in front of them. The enemy warrior they are personally engaging, the ground they are gaining, the sense of momentum building in their favour. The larger patterns of the battle, the movements of units on the flanks, the overall shape of the engagement become secondary to the visceral satisfaction of pushing forward against weakening resistance. This psychological tendency is amplified by the physical realities of formation fighting, where individual soldiers are pressed closely together, their movement constrained by the men on either side of them, their vision limited by helmets and shields, and the dust kicked up by thousands of marching feet. In such circumstances, success breeds a kind of institutional momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to control as more and more soldiers join the forward movement and the formation becomes deeper and more compressed. What begins as a disciplined advance can gradually transform into something closer to a mob, held together by shared purpose and mutual pressure, but increasingly difficult to maneuver or redirect according to changing tactical requirements. Hannibal's plan required his Spanish and Gallic infantry to exploit this Roman psychological tendency by providing just enough resistance to seem like a legitimate military obstacle, while yielding ground at precisely the rate needed to draw the Roman centre forward, without allowing it to recognise that its apparent success was actually the result of enemy design rather than Roman superiority. This was an extraordinarily delicate operation, requiring troops to maintain formation discipline while retreating, something that goes against every instinct of soldiers trained to equate backward movement with defeat, and to time their withdrawal so that it appeared to be the natural consequence of Roman pressure rather than a predetermined tactical manoeuvre. The sources that describe this aspect of the battle, written generations after the events they purport to record, often present Hannibal's tactical conception in terms that suggest almost supernatural prescience and control. They describe formations that bend like drawn bows, lines that curve inward with mathematical precision, and manoeuvres executed with the kind of clockwork timing that would be difficult to achieve, even with modern communication systems and extensively rehearsed troops. These accounts, while dramatic, probably tell us more about how later ages preferred to remember the battle than about what actually happened on that dusty plain in Apulia. The reality was almost certainly messier, more improvisational, and more dependent on the individual decisions of unit commanders who had to respond to rapidly changing circumstances with limited information and no means of coordination beyond voice signals and the movement of standards visible through the dust and confusion of combat. What Hannibal created was not a perfect mechanism, but a framework within which his diverse forces could respond to Roman tactical choices in ways that turned Roman strengths into vulnerabilities. The key insight was not that formations could be manipulated with geometric precision, but that controlled retreat, properly executed, could serve as a weapon more effective than any frontal assault. As the Roman centre pressed forward with growing confidence, sensing victory in the gradual yielding of enemy resistance, they were unknowingly entering a tactical environment where their numerical superiority and formation discipline would become liabilities rather than assets. As the Roman centre presses deeper into what appears to be a gradually collapsing Carthaginian line, pushing forward with the methodical persistence that has made Roman infantry legendary throughout the Mediterranean world, the true architects of Hannibal's design remain motionless on the wings of his formation. Here, arranged in two compact rectangles of disciplined humanity, stand the African veterans who represent the professional corps of the Carthaginian army, men who have spent years learning their craft, not in the romantic campaigns of tribal warfare, but in the patient, unglamorous business of siege work, garrison duty, and the kind of sustained operations that separate soldiers from warriors. These troops are distinguished from their Spanish and Gallic comrades not merely by their equipment, though their captured Roman weapons and standardized armour mark them as something different from the tribal contingents fighting in the centre, but by something more fundamental and more dangerous. The kind of tactical discipline that allows men to wait motionless under extreme pressure, holding their positions while chaos unfolds around them, trusting in a plan they may not fully understand, but which they have been trained to execute with mechanical precision. They have learned to suppress the natural human instincts that drive men to seek safety in movement, to find relief from tension in action, to respond to the sounds of battle with immediate and aggressive participation. Instead, they wait. As the morning heat builds and sweat trickles down beneath their bronze and leather armour, as dust kicked up by the fighting in the centre drifts across their ranks and the sounds of combat grow louder and more urgent. As their Spanish and Gallic allies give ground step by careful step before the advancing Romans, the African infantry remain frozen in their positions like statues carved from dark stone, their shields steady, their spears vertical, their formation as precise as if they were still standing at attention in some peaceful garrison courtyard rather than at the edge of one of history's most decisive battles. This unnatural stillness is the product of training that goes far beyond the simple conditioning that produces competent soldiers. What Hannibal has created in these men is something closer to the components of a machine. Human beings who have been taught to function as parts of a larger mechanism whose operation depends on timing so precise that premature movement by even a single unit could destroy the effectiveness of the entire design. They have rehearsed their role countless times, practicing the complex series of movements that will transform them from a defensive formation into an offensive weapon, learning to execute these maneuvers not through conscious decision-making, but through the kind of muscle memory that operates below the level of rational thought. The signal, when it finally comes, is not the dramatic gesture that later chroniclers would describe, no trumpet fanfare or shouted command that echoes across the battlefield, but something far more subtle, a barely perceptible shift in the position of standards held by officers whose eyes have never left the developing situation in the centre of the field. The moment has arrived when the Roman advance has proceeded far enough to create the conditions that Hannibal's entire tactical conception has been designed to exploit, when the enemy formation has become sufficiently extended and compressed to be vulnerable to the manoeuvre that will transform apparent Carthaginian defeat into decisive victory. The movement that follows unfolds with the kind of eerie precision that seems to violate the natural laws governing human behaviour under extreme stress. The African infantry do not charge forward with the wild enthusiasm that characterises most ancient military manoeuvres, nor do they advance with the steady, methodical pace of troops conducting a routine tactical evolution. Instead, they begin to turn, pivoting inward like massive doors swinging shut, their formation maintaining its integrity, even as its orientation changes, their ranks remaining dressed and their intervals preserved as they execute one of the most difficult manoeuvres in the entire repertoire of ancient warfare. This inward wheeling motion requires each soldier to adjust his position relative to his comrades, to maintain contact with the men on either side of him, while simultaneously changing direction, according to signals that must be transmitted through the formation without disrupting its cohesion. It demands the kind of training that treats human beings as interchangeable components of a larger system, each man knowing not only his own role, but understanding how that role relates to the functions of every other soldier in his unit. It requires above all the psychological discipline that allows men to execute complex movements while under fire, to maintain formation integrity while advancing toward enemy forces that are fighting desperately for their lives. As the African wings begin their inward turn, the tactical situation that has been developing throughout the morning suddenly reveals its true nature. What had appeared to be a straightforward frontal engagement between two conventional armies is transformed into something far more sophisticated and far more deadly. A deliberate trap that has been constructed through the careful manipulation of enemy psychology and the patient application of tactical principles that most commanders of the age would have considered too risky to attempt. The Roman centre, committed to its apparently successful advance, finds itself caught in a gradually tightening embrace, whose ultimate consequences will not become clear until it is far too late to respond effectively. The beauty of the manoeuvre, from a purely technical standpoint, lies not in its dramatic impact, but in its mechanical inevitability. Once the African infantry begin their inward turn, the tactical dynamics of the battle are fundamentally altered in ways that no amount of Roman courage or discipline can reverse. The flanks of the Roman formation, previously secure because protected by the natural limits of the battlefield, are suddenly exposed to attack from an unexpected direction. The mechanism that Hannibal has been constructing throughout the morning now begins to complete itself with the inexorable logic of well-oiled machinery, each component moving according to principles that have been tested and refined through years of practical experience. As the African infantry continue their inward turn and the Roman centre finds itself increasingly compressed by its own success, the final element of the tactical equation materializes from an unexpected direction. the return of Carthaginian cavalry from their victory on the wings, now freed from their engagement with Roman horsemen and available to complete the encirclement that will transform what had begun as a conventional battle into something approaching a natural disaster. The Spanish and Numidian cavalry who had defeated their Roman counterparts in the morning's preliminary actions now reappear behind the Roman lines, like the closing of a door that the Romans had not even realized was open. Their approach is not announced by trumpet calls or dramatic gestures, but becomes apparent through the gradual realization among Roman soldiers that the sounds of combat are now coming from directions where no combat should be possible, from behind their own formations, from positions that should be occupied by their own support troops and supply trains, from the very areas where wounded men had been retreating to seek medical attention and exhausted soldiers had been withdrawing to rest and regroup. This closing of the circle creates a psychological effect that goes far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. Soldiers who had been fighting with confidence born of apparent success suddenly find themselves confronting the possibility that their success has been an illusion, that their advance has been not a victory but a trap, that they are now surrounded by enemies in a situation where the normal rules of battlefield survival no longer apply. The realization spreads through the Roman ranks not as a single moment of revelation, but as a gradual dawning awareness that manifests differently for different units, depending on their position in the formation and their ability to observe the larger patterns of the engagement. For the Roman soldiers in the front ranks still engaged in direct combat with Spanish and Gallic infantry, the change in circumstances becomes apparent only slowly, through subtle shifts in the behaviour of their opponents who suddenly seem less concerned with maintaining defensive positions and more focused on simply holding Roman attention while something else develops elsewhere. For troops in the middle of the formation, the first sign of disaster comes through the breakdown of the communication systems that allow large military units to function as coordinated entities. Orders that should be transmitted from the rear of the formation fail to arrive, messengers sent to request, reinforcements or permission to withdraw simply disappear, and the steady flow of information that allows commanders to understand and respond to changing circumstances gradually dries up. But it is for the soldiers at the rear of the Roman formation that the true nature of their situation becomes most immediately and terrifyingly apparent, as they find themselves facing not the familiar prospect of enemy forces approaching from the front, but the far more disorienting experience of combat developing in areas where their mental maps of the battlefield had assumed safety. Men who had been serving in support roles, guarding supplies, tending wounded, maintaining communication with distant units, suddenly find themselves in direct contact with enemy cavalry, whose presence in these locations violates every assumption about how battles are supposed to unfold. The physical consequences of encirclement in ancient warfare were not primarily a matter of immediate slaughter, but of something more systematic and more devastating. The gradual breakdown of the organizational structures that allow large groups of human beings to function effectively under extreme stress. As the available space within the Roman formation continues to shrink, as units become compressed against each other, and individual soldiers lose the ability to maneuver freely, the disciplined tactical system that had carried Rome to dominance throughout Italy begins to disintegrate not through any single catastrophic failure, but through the accumulation of thousands of small breakdowns in coordination, communication, and command authority. Formations that had maintained precise intervals and carefully rehearsed tactical relationships become compressed into crowds where individual soldiers can barely move their weapons effectively. Unit commanders lose contact with their superiors and their subordinates, as the physical distances required for visual and auditory communication become impossible to maintain in the chaos of increasingly desperate combat. The standardized signals and procedures that had allowed Roman armies to execute complex maneuvers even under extreme pressure become useless when there is no longer sufficient space for maneuvers to be executed or sufficient organization for signals to be transmitted and received. The casualty figures that ancient sources provide for the battle vary considerably, as they do for most engagements of this period, but even the most conservative estimates suggest losses that were catastrophic by any measure. Perhaps 50,000 Roman and Allied dead, including one of the two consuls commanding the army, along with 80 senators and hundreds of knights, and other members of the Roman aristocracy. More liberal estimates approach 70,000 killed, figures that would represent one of the most devastating single-day losses in military history. What makes these numbers particularly significant is not merely their scale, but what they reveal about the nature of ancient battle when organisational coherence breaks down completely. In normal circumstances, armies suffer their heaviest casualties, not during the main engagement, but during the pursuit that follows defeat, when fleeing soldiers become vulnerable to mounted troops who can overtake and destroy them in detail. At Cannae, the encirclement meant that there was no opportunity for organised retreat, no possibility of surrender or flight, nothing but the grinding mathematics of attrition as an entire army was methodically destroyed within the confines of its own formation. When the sun finally set on that August evening, casting long shadows across a field that had been transformed from farmland into something resembling a vast charnel house, the silence that settled over Cannae was unlike anything the Italian countryside had ever known. It was not the peaceful quiet of evening in agricultural regions, where the day's work ends with the satisfied tiredness of honest labour, but something far more profound and disturbing, the silence of absence, of voices that would never speak again, of names that would no longer be called in the Roman Forum or the assemblies of allied cities scattered across the Italian peninsula. The work of counting began almost immediately, not through any organised effort by military officials, most of whom lay dead among their men, but through the grim mathematics of survival that drove the handful of Roman soldiers who had managed to escape the encirclement to take inventory of their losses. What they discovered was not merely a military defeat, but something approaching a demographic catastrophe that would reshape the social and political landscape of Rome for generations to come. The army that had marched confidently toward Cannae a few days earlier had contained within its ranks a substantial portion of the Roman ruling class, men whose family names appeared on the earliest records of the Republic, and whose ancestors had guided Rome through the long centuries of expansion that had made the city master of most of Italy. Among the dead was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one of the two consuls commanding the army, a man whose political career had embodied the traditional Roman ideals of public service and military competence. His death was not merely the loss of an individual, however distinguished, but the elimination of a crucial node in the complex network of relationships that held Roman society together. Paulus had been connected by blood, marriage, or political alliance to dozens of other prominent families, and his disappearance from the Roman Senate created a void that could not be filled simply by promoting the next qualified candidate to consular rank. With him died 80 members of the Senate, men who had spent their lives learning the intricate business of governing a complex state that was part city, part confederation, and part emerging empire. These were not simply legislators in the modern sense, but administrators, diplomats, military commanders, and judges whose accumulated experience in managing the affairs of Rome and its allies represented an irreplaceable repository of practical knowledge about how to hold together a political system that depended as much on personal relationships and institutional memory as on written laws and formal procedures. The casualty lists, when they could finally be compiled from the reports of survivors, and the grim evidence scattered across the battlefield, read like a directory of Roman aristocracy. Hundreds of knights, members of the wealthy equestrian class who formed the backbone of Roman military leadership and commercial enterprise, had died alongside their social inferiors, their expensive equipment and thoroughbred horses now serving only to make their corpses easier to identify among the anonymous thousands who had shared their fate. Tribunes, centurions, and other officers whose names appeared in the military records of previous campaigns lay mingled with the common soldiers they had led, united in death, as they had been in the disciplined formations that had carried them toward disaster. The social implications of these losses went far beyond their immediate military significance. Roman political culture depended on the existence of a stable aristocratic class whose members could afford to spend years in unpaid public service, building the networks of obligation and patronage that enabled the Republic to function, without a permanent bureaucracy or standing army. The death of so many prominent citizens created gaps in this system that could not be quickly filled, since the knowledge and relationships that made aristocratic leadership effective could only be acquired through decades of patient apprenticeship in the complex arts of Roman statecraft. In the city of Rome itself, the news of Cannae arrived not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a gradual accumulation of terrible certainties that began with rumours brought by the first stragglers to reach safety and continued for days as more survivors trickled in with their fragmentary accounts of the disaster. The Senate, meeting in emergency session with its ranks now significantly depleted, faced the unprecedented challenge of responding to a catastrophe that threatened not just Roman military power, but the fundamental stability of the Roman political system. The first reports were met with the kind of institutional disbelief that comes from experiencing something outside the normal range of possibilities that a society has prepared itself to handle. Roman armies had suffered defeats before, sometimes serious ones, but never had an entire consular army simply vanished from existence, taking with it such a substantial portion of Rome's political and military leadership. The mechanisms that the Republic had developed for dealing with military emergencies, the appointment of dictators, the raising of new legions, the recall of troops from distant theatres, all assumed that the basic structure of Roman society would remain intact, that there would be enough experienced leaders available to implement whatever measures the crisis required. As the full scope of the disaster became clear, however, Roman resilience began to manifest itself in ways that would have seemed impossible to predict from the magnitude of the catastrophe. The Senate, though decimated, began the process of co-opting new members to replace the dead, drawing on the pool of former magistrates and other qualified citizens to restore the institution's numerical strength. More importantly, the leadership that remained made a series of crucial decisions that would determine whether the Republic would survive this unprecedented test of its fundamental assumptions about how civilized societies should respond to existential threats. The most remarkable aspect of Rome's response to the catastrophe at Cannae was not any single dramatic gesture of defiance or desperate measure of military reorganization, but rather a series of quiet, deliberate decisions that revealed something fundamental about how the Roman political system understood the relationship between immediate survival and long-term institutional integrity. When Hannibal's representatives appeared before the walls of Rome shortly after the battle, bearing the traditional symbols of diplomatic immunity and carrying proposals for the negotiated settlement that any rational observer might have expected, they encountered something they had not anticipated. A refusal so complete and so principled that it seemed to violate the basic rules of political calculation that governed interactions between civilized states. The proposals themselves were not unreasonable by the standards of ancient diplomatic practice. Hannibal offered to exchange prisoners according to established customs, to negotiate terms for ending the war that would recognize Carthaginian interests in Spain and other disputed territories, and to establish the kind of stable peace that would allow both republics to return to the profitable business of commerce and territorial expansion in regions where their interests did not directly conflict. These were precisely the sorts of arrangements that had concluded dozens of previous wars throughout the Mediterranean world, practical solutions that acknowledged military realities while preserving the essential dignity of both parties to the conflict. But the Senate's response revealed the operation of a different kind of logic entirely, one that understood the immediate crisis at Cannae not as an isolated military defeat that could be addressed through conventional diplomatic means, but as a fundamental test of the principles that made Roman power sustainable over the long term. The decision to refuse negotiation was not driven by pride or stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality, but by a cold calculation about what kinds of precedents the Republic needed to establish if it intended to survive in a world where weakness invited aggression, and any sign of willingness to compromise under pressure would inevitably lead to more pressure from more enemies. Central to this calculation was the question of prisoners and ransom, an issue that might seem peripheral to modern observers but which carried enormous symbolic weight in the political culture of the ancient world. The Roman army destroyed at Cannae had included thousands of citizens and allies who had survived the battle only to fall into Carthaginian hands, and their families naturally expected that the Roman government would make whatever arrangements were necessary to secure their release. The payment of ransom for captured soldiers was not merely accepted practice in ancient warfare, but was considered a basic obligation that civilized states owed to their own people. The Senate's decision to abandon these prisoners to their fate was therefore not simply a matter of military strategy, but a deliberate choice to prioritize abstract principles over immediate human suffering, to value the long-term interests of the state over the short-term welfare of individual citizens. The reasoning behind this harsh decision was carefully articulated in the debates that ancient historians record, though we cannot be certain how accurately these sources reflect the actual discussions that took place in the traumatic days following Cannae. The argument, as it has come down to us, was essentially pedagogical, that Rome needed to teach both its own citizens and its enemies certain lessons about the consequences of defeat, the price of surrender, and the determination of the Roman people to continue fighting regardless of immediate costs. By refusing to pay ransom for prisoners, the Senate was establishing a precedent that would discourage future Roman soldiers from surrendering when faced with overwhelming odds, since they could not expect their government to secure their release through negotiation. More importantly, it was sending a message to potential enemies that Rome would not respond to military pressure by making the kinds of concessions that would only invite further pressure. This policy required a form of institutional discipline that few political systems could have sustained under such circumstances. The families of the abandoned prisoners included some of the most prominent citizens in Rome, men whose political influence and social connections might have been expected to force a modification of the Senate's position. That these pressures were resisted suggests the operation of a political culture that had developed mechanisms for subordinating individual interest to collective decision-making, even when the human costs of such subordination were visible and immediate. The psychological dimensions of this choice extended far beyond its immediate military implications. By refusing to negotiate from a position of weakness, Rome was essentially betting its entire future on its ability to recover from the Cannae disaster through its own resources rather than through accommodation with its enemies. This was a gamble that required not just confidence in Roman military and political institutions, but faith in the fundamental soundness of the system that had built Roman power over the preceding centuries. The decision also reflected a sophisticated understanding of how reputation functions in international relations, particularly in a world where military capability was only one factor, determining which states would survive and which would be absorbed by their neighbours. A Rome that paid ransom and negotiated peace after Cannae would be seen as a different kind of political entity than the Rome that had conquered Italy through patient accumulation of victories over many decades. The precedent established by accommodation under pressure would inevitably shape how future enemies calculated the costs and benefits of challenging Roman interests. The reconstruction of Roman power after Cannae was not accomplished through any single dramatic gesture or heroic rally to the colours, but through the patient, methodical application of institutional procedures that had been refined over centuries of republican government. The Senate's decision to reject Carthaginian overtures was only the beginning of a process that would test the fundamental flexibility of Roman political culture, forcing the Republic's leaders to discover exactly how far traditional norms could be stretched without breaking the essential framework that had made Rome successful in the first place. The most immediate challenge was numerical: how to replace the enormous human losses that Cannae had inflicted on Roman military capacity. The traditional levy system, which had served Rome well throughout its expansion across Italy, depended on the availability of citizens who met specific property requirements and age restrictions. These men formed the backbone of Roman military power not merely because of their numbers, but because of their stake in the Roman system. Property owners who fought with the knowledge that victory meant the protection of their own land and defeat meant the loss of everything they had worked to accumulate. But the disaster at Cannae had eliminated tens of thousands of precisely these citizens, creating gaps in Roman military capacity that could not be filled simply by calling up the next age cohort or expanding the geographical range from which recruits were drawn. The solution required innovations that challenged some of the basic assumptions about who could be trusted to fight for Rome, and under what circumstances the traditional boundaries of citizenship might be expanded to meet existential threats. The Senate authorized the recruitment of volunteers from social categories that had previously been excluded from military service: landless citizens who had been considered too poor to have a sufficient stake in Roman success, freedmen whose recent servitude had been thought to make them unreliable in situations requiring absolute loyalty, and even slaves who were promised manumission in exchange for military service. These measures represented not a temporary expedient but a fundamental shift in Roman thinking about the relationship between military service and civic status, one that would have lasting consequences for the development of Roman society in the centuries that followed. The financial implications of rebuilding Roman military power from scratch were equally challenging and equally revealing of institutional adaptability under pressure. The traditional Roman approach to military finance had been relatively straightforward. Citizens provided their own equipment and served without pay for campaigns that were expected to fund themselves through plunder and tribute extracted from defeated enemies. But the new circumstances required the Roman government to assume financial responsibilities that it had never previously undertaken, supporting larger armies for longer periods while generating revenue from a tax base that had been significantly reduced by military casualties and economic disruption. The solutions that emerged were improvisational but effective, drawing on the accumulated expertise of Roman financial administrators who understood how to mobilize resources through methods that would place the burden on those segments of society best able to bear it without compromising the broader war effort. Wealthy citizens were asked to advance funds that would theoretically be repaid from future military successes. Temples were persuaded to loan their treasure to the state on similar terms, and new taxes were imposed on activities that had previously been exempt from government interference. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis forced Rome to experiment with forms of emergency government that tested the boundaries between republican institutions and the kind of centralized authority that Romans had traditionally associated with tyranny. The appointment of Marcus Junius Pyrrha as dictator represented a return to an ancient Roman practice that had fallen into disuse during the periods of routine expansion when normal consular government had proven adequate to the challenges Rome faced. The dictatorship, as it functioned in this emergency context, was not the permanent seizure of power that the word suggests to modern audiences, but something more limited and more interesting, a temporary concentration of authority designed to enable rapid decision-making and resource mobilization while preserving the essential structures of republican government. Pyrrha's mandate was explicitly limited in both scope and duration, focused on the specific tasks of military reconstruction and defense against immediate threats, with the understanding that normal constitutional procedures would be restored as soon as circumstances permitted. The success of these emergency measures can be seen not just in their immediate military effectiveness, but in their broader demonstration of institutional resilience, the capacity of a complex political system to adapt to unprecedented challenges without losing the essential characteristics that had made it successful in the first place. Rome emerged from the Cannae crisis not merely as a reconstituted military power, but as a political entity that had learned important lessons about the relationship between flexibility and stability, between innovation and tradition. The famous exchange between Hannibal and his cavalry commander Hannibal, as it has come down to us through the centuries, carries all the hallmarks of those perfectly constructed historical anecdotes that seem almost too apt to be entirely true. According to the traditional account, as Hannibal surveyed the field at Cannae in the aftermath of his extraordinary victory, Hannibal approached him with urgent advice. "Give me the cavalry," he is supposed to have said, "and in 5 days you shall dine on the Capitoline Hill. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." The story concludes with Hannibal's refusal to march immediately on Rome, a decision that Hannibal allegedly declared would prove to be the turning point of the entire war. This exchange has all the dramatic perfection that later generations of historians and moralists found irresistible. The moment of supreme opportunity, the bold subordinate offering decisive counsel, the great commander's fatal hesitation, and the prophetic warning that subsequent events would vindicate. But like many such perfectly constructed moments in ancient historiography, it probably tells us more about how later ages preferred to understand the complexities of strategic decision-making than about what actually transpired in the immediate aftermath of the battle. The reality of Hannibal's situation following Cannae was far more complicated than any dramatic dialogue could adequately capture. His army, despite its stunning tactical success, remained fundamentally what it had been since crossing the Alps. A relatively small force operating hundreds of miles from its nearest secure base, dependent entirely on what it could capture or extract from the Italian countryside, and composed of diverse ethnic groups whose continued loyalty depended on Hannibal's ability to provide them with regular evidence that service in his ranks offered better prospects than any available alternative. More crucially, the victory at Cannae, however complete from a tactical standpoint, had not fundamentally altered the strategic realities that constrained Carthaginian operations in Italy. Rome remained a fortified city defended by walls that had been strengthened and extended over centuries of gradual expansion, protected by a citizenry that had not been present at the battle, and therefore retained both the will and the capacity to resist siege, the infrastructure required for a successful siege, artillery capable of breaching stone fortifications, supply lines adequate to sustain a besieging army for the months or years that such operations typically required, and engineering expertise sufficient to overcome the defensive advantages that urban warfare provided to determined defenders was simply not available to an army that had been campaigning in hostile territory for more than 2 years. The logistical challenges alone would have been insurmountable. Besieging Rome would have required Hannibal to concentrate his entire force in a fixed position for an extended period, making his army vulnerable to attack by whatever new forces the Romans could raise, while simultaneously demanding a level of supply organisation that his polyglot forces had never needed to develop. The countryside around Rome, unlike the agricultural regions of southern Italy where Hannibal had been operating, had been systematically stripped of resources that could sustain a hostile army, and the city's walls had been designed by generations of Roman engineers who understood exactly how to make urban fortifications resistant to the kinds of siege techniques that Mediterranean armies could deploy. But the most fundamental obstacle to any march on Rome was strategic rather than tactical. Hannibal's entire campaign in Italy had been premised not on the conquest of Roman territory through direct assault, but on the gradual dissolution of the alliance system that was the true foundation of Roman power. His victories at Trebia and Trasimene had been valuable, not primarily for their immediate military results, but for their demonstration to Rome's Italian allies that Roman military supremacy was not inevitable, that alternative arrangements might be possible, and that loyalty to Rome might not be the surest guarantee of long-term security and prosperity. This strategy had achieved some notable successes in the aftermath of each victory, as communities that had been Roman allies for generations began to recalculate their interests in light of changing military circumstances. But it was a strategy that required patience, careful diplomacy, and the kind of sustained pressure that could only be maintained by an army that remained mobile, unpredictable, and capable of responding to opportunities as they developed across the Italian peninsula. The years that followed Cannae unfolded not with the dramatic rhythm of decisive battles and spectacular manoeuvres that had characterized the early phase of Hannibal's Italian campaign, but with the slower, more corrosive tempo of a conflict that had settled into the patient work of attrition. This was warfare transformed from the collision of armies into something more like the administration of competing governments, each trying to demonstrate to the scattered communities of Italy that it offered better prospects for survival and prosperity than the alternatives available. The grand gestures and theatrical victories that dominate historical memory gave way to the unglamorous business of maintaining garrisons, negotiating with wavering allies, and managing the complex logistics of keeping armies fed and equipped, while operating in territory that was never entirely friendly and never completely secure. Hannibal's army, reduced by the inevitable casualties of continuous campaigning, but reinforced by recruits from communities that had chosen to abandon their Roman allegiances, became something unprecedented in Mediterranean warfare, a mobile state that carried its own political institutions wherever it moved. The diverse collection of Carthaginians, Spaniards, Gauls, and Italians who formed his forces had evolved beyond their origins as a temporary military expedition into something closer to a nomadic confederation, complete with its own diplomatic corps, its own methods of taxation and tribute collection, and its own judicial systems for resolving the disputes that inevitably arose when different ethnic groups with different customs were forced to cooperate in close proximity for extended periods. The challenges of maintaining cohesion in such a force went far beyond the normal difficulties of military command and touched on fundamental questions of identity and loyalty that no ancient commander had ever been required to address. Spanish warriors who had originally enlisted for a single campaign season found themselves spending years in Italian territories whose languages they could not speak, fighting against enemies whose grievances against Carthage meant nothing to them personally, sustained only by the promise of plunder and the personal relationships they had developed with their immediate commanders. Gallic volunteers discovered that the adventure they had sought in crossing the Alps had transformed into something more like permanent exile, cut off from their tribal homelands by hundreds of miles of hostile territory and dependent for their very survival on the continued success of a cause they had never fully understood. For the Italian communities caught between these competing claims on their loyalty, the years after Cannae presented a series of impossible choices that had no clear resolution and no obvious endpoint. Remaining loyal to Rome meant accepting the burden of supporting Roman garrisons, contributing to Roman military levies, and enduring whatever economic hardships Roman strategic requirements might impose, all while watching Carthaginian forces operate with apparent impunity in regions where Roman protection had proven inadequate. But joining Hannibal offered no guarantee of security either, since Carthaginian control was necessarily temporary and partial, dependent on the presence of mobile forces that could not remain in any single location long enough to provide genuine protection against Roman retaliation. The war of posts and sieges that developed from these circumstances was perhaps more psychologically exhausting than the spectacular battles that had preceded it, because it offered no prospect of decisive resolution and no clear criteria for measuring progress toward victory or defeat. Towns changed hands repeatedly as Roman and Carthaginian forces moved back and forth across the Italian landscape, each trying to establish control over key strategic positions without committing resources to prolonged siege operations that would tie down troops needed elsewhere. The inhabitants of these contested communities lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing whether the soldiers currently occupying their walls represented permanent liberation or merely the latest in a series of temporary occupations. Rome's response to these conditions revealed the institutional patience that had always been one of the Republic's greatest strategic assets. Rather than seeking the kind of dramatic confrontation that had led to disaster at Cannae, Roman commanders adopted what amounted to a strategy of methodical strangulation, using their superior resources and more secure supply lines to gradually limit Hannibal's freedom of movement while avoiding the pitched battles where Carthaginian tactical superiority might prove decisive. This approach required a form of military discipline that was perhaps more difficult to maintain than the courage needed for frontal assault, because it demanded that Roman soldiers and their commanders accept the frustration of watching enemy forces operate successfully, while restraining themselves from responding with the kind of aggressive action that Roman military culture traditionally celebrated. The result was a kind of warfare that had more in common with modern concepts of counterinsurgency than with the heroic confrontations that ancient sources preferred to describe, a slow contest of endurance and administration that would ultimately be decided not by the tactical brilliance of individual commanders, but by the capacity of competing political systems to sustain the unglamorous work of governance under the extreme stress of prolonged conflict. While Hannibal manoeuvred through the hills and valleys of southern Italy, with the patient skill of a master craftsman working on his greatest creation, the broader currents of the Second Punic War were flowing in directions that would ultimately prove more decisive than any tactical brilliance displayed on Italian battlefields. The conflict that had begun as a struggle for dominance in the Western Mediterranean was revealing itself to be something more complex and more fundamental, a test of which political system could more effectively mobilize and sustain the vast networks of resources, alliances, and economic relationships that made empire possible in the ancient world. The key to understanding why Hannibal's extraordinary achievements in Italy would ultimately prove insufficient lies not in the dramatic encounters between armies, but in the quieter, more systematic work of cutting the economic and political arteries that had enabled Carthaginian power to project itself across such enormous distances in the first place. While Roman attention was naturally focused on the immediate threat posed by enemy forces operating within sight of the city walls, Roman strategic thinking had never lost sight of the larger question: how to make it impossible for Carthage to sustain its Italian expedition regardless of its tactical successes. Spain remained the crucial theatre in this broader contest, though its importance was measured not in the glory of individual battles, but in the more prosaic mathematics of silver production, tribal tribute, and military recruitment. The Carthaginian position in Iberia, so carefully constructed over 25 years of patient investment and political manipulation, represented far more than a distant province or secondary front. It was the foundation upon which Hannibal's entire Italian strategy rested, providing the revenues that funded his diverse army, the diplomatic relationships that had made possible his original recruitment of non-Carthaginian troops, and the strategic depth that allowed Carthage to contemplate operations far from its North African homeland. Roman operations in Spain, initially conceived as a means of preventing Carthaginian reinforcements from reaching Italy, gradually evolved into something more ambitious and more threatening to the fundamental structure of Carthaginian power. The brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, operating with relatively modest forces, but with clear understanding of their strategic objectives, began the patient work of dismantling the political and economic arrangements that had made Spanish resources available to Carthaginian strategic planning. This was not conquest in the traditional sense of occupying territory and imposing direct administration, but something more subtle and ultimately more effective: the systematic disruption of the relationships between Carthaginian commanders and Spanish tribal leaders that had made voluntary cooperation possible. The process was slow, often frustrating, and rarely dramatic enough to generate the kinds of dispatches that would excite public opinion in Rome. It involved careful attention to the particular grievances and interests of individual Spanish communities, patient negotiation with tribal chieftains who needed to be convinced that Roman victory was more probable than Carthaginian success, and the gradual construction of an alternative political framework that could provide Spanish communities with security and economic opportunity without dependence on Carthaginian protection. As Roman influence in Spain expanded and Carthaginian control contracted, the effects were felt not immediately in Italy, but in the gradually increasing difficulty that Hannibal experienced in maintaining the complex multinational coalition that formed his army. Spanish reinforcements, which had been essential to replacing the inevitable casualties of continuous campaigning, became increasingly difficult to arrange as the communities that had previously provided such troops found themselves under Roman influence or direct control. More importantly, the silver revenues that had funded Carthaginian operations throughout the Mediterranean began to flow toward Rome rather than Carthage, gradually shifting the financial balance that determined which side could sustain prolonged conflict. The war at sea, though less visible to later generations obsessed with land campaigns and individual heroics, played an equally crucial role in determining the ultimate outcome of the conflict. Roman naval superiority, established during the First Punic War and maintained through continuous investment in shipbuilding and naval training, made it increasingly difficult for Carthage to coordinate operations between its various theatres of activity. Supply lines between North Africa and Spain became vulnerable to Roman interdiction. Communications between Carthaginian commanders in different regions became sporadic and unreliable, and the movement of troops and resources across the Mediterranean required elaborate precautions that made rapid response to changing circumstances virtually impossible. Perhaps most significantly, Roman diplomatic efforts in North Africa began to bear fruit as tribal leaders who had previously supported Carthaginian interests started to reconsider their loyalties in light of changing military circumstances. The Numidian cavalry that had been so crucial to Hannibal's tactical successes were recruited from communities whose allegiances were pragmatic rather than ideological, based on calculations about which patron could provide better protection and more lucrative opportunities for their young warriors. As Roman influence in the region expanded and Carthaginian resources became increasingly strained, these calculations began to shift in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to Carthaginian strategic planning. The cumulative effect of these developments was not immediately apparent to observers focused on the dramatic events unfolding in Italy, but the patient accumulation of Roman advantages in these peripheral theatres was gradually creating conditions that would make Hannibal's position in Italy untenable, regardless of his continued tactical superiority over Roman armies in the field. The recall came not as a dramatic summons or desperate plea, but as the quiet acknowledgement of arithmetic that had been building for years, the simple recognition that Hannibal's extraordinary achievements in Italy could no longer justify the resources required to sustain them when those same resources were desperately needed to defend Carthage itself against an enemy who had learned to apply Carthaginian strategic methods with Roman institutional patience. The message that reached Hannibal sometime in the year 203 before the Common Era was brief and matter-of-fact, carrying none of the emotional weight that later chroniclers would attribute to this moment of supreme historical irony. The greatest military genius of his age ordered home just as his long campaign in Italy was approaching its 16th year. The young Roman commander who had made this recall necessary was Publius Cornelius Scipio, son and nephew of the Roman generals who had died fighting in Spain, inheritor of both their strategic understanding and their personal motivation to complete the systematic dismantling of Carthaginian power that they had begun. Scipio's African campaign represented the full maturation of Roman strategic thinking, the application of lessons learned through 16 years of warfare against an enemy whose tactical superiority had forced Rome to discover new ways of thinking about how military power could be projected across vast distances and sustained in hostile environments. The invasion of Africa was not the impulsive gesture of a young commander seeking personal glory, but the culmination of careful preparation that had occupied Roman strategic planning for years. Scipio understood, as Hannibal had understood when he crossed the Alps, that successful operations in enemy territory required more than military competence. They demanded the construction of local alliances, the manipulation of existing political divisions, and the patient work of convincing indigenous populations that cooperation with the invader offered better prospects than loyalty to the established government. The key to Scipio's success lay in his ability to exploit the same weakness in Carthaginian power that Roman operations in Spain had been targeting for more than a decade: the dependence on voluntary cooperation from African tribal leaders whose allegiances were pragmatic rather than ideological. The Numidian cavalry that had been so crucial to Hannibal's tactical successes were recruited from communities that maintained complex relationships with Carthage, relationships that could be disrupted by a competent enemy who understood how to offer alternative arrangements that served tribal interests more effectively. When Hannibal finally returned to the continent he had left as a confident young general at the height of his powers, he found himself facing strategic circumstances that were almost the reverse of those he had created for Roman commanders in Italy. His army, though still formidable in its professional competence and personal loyalty to his leadership, was operating in familiar territory that had become hostile, dependent on local resources that were no longer reliably available, facing an enemy who had learned to fight Carthaginian-style warfare with Roman discipline and Roman institutional support. The final confrontation at Zama, fought in the autumn of 202, unfolded with the kind of tactical symmetry that would have appealed to ancient historians who appreciated the dramatic possibilities of role reversal and poetic justice. Many of the same principles that had produced Carthaginian victory at Cannae were now employed by Roman forces whose commander had studied those principles with the careful attention of a master craftsman, learning from a superior practitioner of his art. The crucial difference lay not in individual tactical innovation, but in the broader strategic context that determined which army could fight, with confidence in ultimate victory, and which was constrained by the knowledge that defeat meant not just military failure, but the end of everything that had made the war worth fighting. The terms of the peace that followed were calculated not merely to end the immediate conflict, but to ensure that Carthage would never again possess the capacity to challenge Roman hegemony in the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian fleet was reduced to a token force. The silver mines of Spain were permanently lost, and the city's freedom to make war or peace was subordinated to Roman approval, conditions that transformed what had been one of the great powers of the ancient world into something closer to a client state whose continued existence depended on Roman tolerance rather than Carthaginian strength. For Hannibal himself, the years that remained offered the melancholy satisfaction of applying his strategic intelligence to the more limited challenges of governing a diminished city-state, managing the complex negotiations required to minimize Roman interference in Carthaginian internal affairs, and serving as a living reminder of what Carthage had once been capable of achieving when its resources were directed by leadership equal to the scope of its ambitions. And so we return, after this long journey through strategy and suffering, triumph and loss, to the quiet plain in Apulia where our story began. Not as it exists in any physical sense, for the fields around Cannae have been ploughed and planted countless times since that August morning in 216 before the Common Era, but as it exists in memory, transformed from a simple geographical location into something far more enduring and far more dangerous, an idea that outlived all the men who fought and died there, a warning encoded in a place name that would echo through the corridors of military academies and government councils for more than 2,000 years. The Battle of Cannae entered human consciousness not merely as a historical event to be recorded and remembered, but as a cautionary tale about the relationship between confidence and catastrophe, a demonstration of how quickly the most sophisticated systems can collapse when their fundamental assumptions are challenged by an intelligence patient enough to understand their weaknesses and ruthless enough to exploit them. For the Romans who survived the disaster and the generations who inherited its memory, Cannae became a permanent reminder that no advantage is so complete, no position so secure, no enemy so thoroughly defeated that vigilance can be relaxed or preparation abandoned. The institutional changes that Rome implemented in response to the Cannae disaster reveal how profoundly the experience had shaken Roman confidence in their traditional methods of governance and warfare. The rigid annual cycle of consular elections, which had contributed to the political pressures that drove Rome's commanders toward premature confrontation with Hannibal, was modified to allow for more flexible responses to strategic emergencies. The traditional reluctance to grant extended commands to individual generals was overcome by the recognition that some military situations required the kind of sustained, coherent leadership that could only be provided by commanders who were freed from the normal constraints of republican term limits. Perhaps most significantly, the Roman military system underwent fundamental reforms that reflected lessons learned not just about battlefield tactics, but about the deeper organizational principles that make large, complex institutions resilient under extreme stress. The standardization of training, equipment, and procedures was extended and refined to create the kind of professional competence that could function effectively even when normal command structures were disrupted or destroyed. New emphasis was placed on developing multiple layers of leadership, so that the loss of senior officers would not automatically result in the collapse of entire formations. But the shadow of Cannae extended far beyond its immediate influence on Roman institutional development. For later generations of military theorists and political leaders, the battle became a kind of Platonic ideal of tactical perfection, studied and analysed as an example of how superior intelligence and careful preparation could overcome seemingly insurmountable material disadvantages. The double envelopment that destroyed the Roman army became the tactical manoeuvre that every ambitious general hoped to replicate, the gold standard against which all other battlefield achievements were measured. This obsession with recreating Cannae's tactical brilliance was not always beneficial to those who attempted it. History is littered with commanders who sought to repeat Hannibal's masterpiece without fully understanding the unique circumstances that had made it possible. Military leaders who focused so intently on reproducing the geometric patterns of the battle that they lost sight of the broader strategic considerations that determine whether tactical success can be translated into lasting political advantage. The lesson of Cannae, properly understood, was not that double envelopment represented some universal key to military victory, but that successful warfare required the kind of systematic analysis of enemy strengths and weaknesses that could identify the specific approach most likely to succeed under particular circumstances. The deeper wisdom embedded in the story of Cannae has less to do with military technique than with the fundamental fragility of all human institutions, however powerful they may appear in their moments of greatest success. The Roman army that marched confidently toward its destruction in Apulia was not weak or incompetent, but represented the full development of a military system that had conquered most of Italy through the patient application of proven methods. Its destruction served as a permanent reminder that strength can become weakness, that advantages can be turned into vulnerabilities, and that the very characteristics that make a system successful in stable conditions may become liabilities when those conditions change. For Rome itself, the ultimate lesson of Cannae was not tactical but institutional. That survival in a competitive world required not just military effectiveness, but the kind of adaptive capacity that could learn from disaster, modify failed approaches, and discover new sources of strength even in the midst of apparent collapse. The Rome that emerged from the crucible of the Second Punic War was not the same political entity that had entered it, but something more resilient, more flexible, and ultimately more dangerous to its enemies, a state that had learned to see crisis not as evidence of systemic failure, but as opportunity for institutional evolution. As evening settles over the Apulian plain and the modern world grows quiet around us, we might reflect on how the lessons embedded in this ancient disaster continue to resonate across the centuries that separate us from that vanished world. The specific technologies and political arrangements that shaped the conflict between Rome and Carthage have long since disappeared, but the fundamental questions remain unchanged. How do we build institutions that can survive the test of unexpected challenges? How do we maintain the vigilance necessary to detect emerging threats? And how do we preserve the capacity for adaptation that allows human communities to learn, grow, and endure even in the face of catastrophic failure? The plain at Cannae keeps its secrets now, peaceful under stars that once looked down on one of history's greatest disasters, offering its quiet testimony to the eternal truth that all human achievement is temporary, all power is fragile, and all wisdom begins with the humble recognition of how much we do not know.